You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sebastian Strangio, the Diplomats Southeast Asia editor. Sebastian, how are you doing today?
Good, Ankit. How are you?
Doing well, thanks for asking. It's good to be back with you on the show, as I'm sure our listeners will have already put two and two together on this, but we are here to talk about recent events, and ongoing events indeed, in Myanmar. So, on the morning of February 1st, the democratically elected members of Myanmar's ruling party, the National League for Democracy, were deposed, removed from power by the Tatmadaw, the country's military. The military declared a year-long state of emergency and declared that power had now been vested in the commander-in-chief of the defense services, Min Aung Hlaing. This amounts to a coup d'etat, and it occurred the day before the parliament was meant to be sworn in. So this is part of the fallout of the outcome of the general election last year. Sebastian, I'm delighted, of course, to have you, given that you are a full-time analyst of this part of the world, and I know you focus quite a bit on Myanmar. The place I want to start with this discussion, there's a lot to cover here, but the place I want to start, what I found sort of striking is that it seemed to me, at least looking from the outside in, that a lot of knowledgeable Southeast Asia analysts were somewhat caught off guard by the timing of this coup, right? Coups are never something that one really expects, so they do tend to be surprising and indeed succeed as a result of that surprise in many ways. I think we've had lingering signs that the military wasn't too happy with its general lack of popularity in the country. How did you react when you first heard the news? I mean, did it catch you off guard?
It caught me off guard. I mean, one of the things that a lot of observers of Myanmar have sort of struggled to comprehend in the wake of the coup is why the military would choose to do something like this. I mean, as the previous constitution, or it's still technically in place, the 2008 constitution contains a raft of safeguards of the military's power. Indeed, it was drafted with the specific aim of preserving a central role for the military in Myanmar's affairs. It gave the military a quarter of seats in parliament, control of three powerful ministries, and other special powers. Indeed, they are claiming that this state of emergency is, in conformity with the Constitution, and has been, and so they've continued to keep that document. They haven't thrown that document out yet. But what a lot of us have been trying to get our hands around the last few days is why the military would choose to dismantle or choose to intervene in such a way, given that the system that it designed to safeguard its own power and prerogatives had actually been working quite well. And I think, there's been a lot of theories advanced, both political, personal, even psychological, to explain why this is happening now. And I think the truth is probably, there's probably small amounts of truth in each of those explanations.
Well, let me press you a little bit on that. I mean, being fully cognizant that we're 3 days out from this, or sorry, 4 days out from this, and things are still early. Early hypotheses can often turn out to be wrong as we get more information. But what's the explanation that you're most drawn to?
I think that the explanation that I've heard that I think makes the most sense is that the system that the military created, the electoral system under the 2008 Constitution, was not working quite as it had intended. I think a couple of factors here. One is that the military tends to overestimate how popular it is amongst the Myanmar public. I think part of that has to do with its own self-mythology as the sort of guardian of the Union, the one force that has prevented Myanmar from fracturing. This is very central to the Tatmadaw's self-perception. And I think, being sort of steeped within that, a lot of the senior commanders in the Tatmadaw found it hard to come to grips with just how unpopular they are. I think also that, the specific electoral system that the military chose when they drafted the 2008 Constitution is a majoritarian system, which benefits large parties, overrepresents large parties, and makes it difficult for smaller parties to gain, a significant share of seats in parliament, even if they win a decent percentage of the vote. And I think that after the result of the 2020 election, when the NLD won, another massive landslide, Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing and other members of, the military were facing the reality that the system they'd created, might simply have locked in a perpetual NRD majority. And I think that his, Min Aung Hlaing is there's talk that he has presidential ambitions of his own. I think he was faced with the reality that under the present system, he had very little chance of ever becoming president or holding any other senior cabinet role. One could, so that seems to me to make the most sense. But I think there's also probably, an element of pique in the way that the NLD has sort of dismissed the military's concerns about electoral fraud. Quite rightly, I would add, they've offered no real evidence that there was any, large scale electoral fraud at the November election. And perhaps the sense that the NLD was sort of, not giving them the respect that they deserved as sort of the sort of the guardian of the union and an institution which perceives itself to be very central to, Myanmar nationalism and the sort of advancement of the state's interests.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so yeah, I do want to spend a little bit more time on internal issues before sort of zooming out and talking a little bit about the international reaction and the regional repercussions.
Sure.
Myanmar has no shortage of internal security issues. Rakhine State, the periphery more broadly. And actually, in preparing for this podcast, I was actually reading some of your recent writing in the aftermath of the coup, and you made a very interesting point about the coup sort of emphasizing the core periphery or the center periphery splits in Myanmar. So, just to push you a little bit on that, I mean, how do you anticipate or at least what do you see as being the primary consequences of this coup in terms of the internal security situation from the northern peripheries to Rakhine and the borderlands more generally?
Well, at the moment, it's very difficult to say. There has been some talk that the military is, now that they're back in charge, are, wanting to push forward peace talks with certain groups. But the military has a pattern of sort of dealing with certain groups while waging war on others, and then, after a certain amount of time, reversing that and opening talks with the groups that's previously fighting, and then conflict breaking out with the others. So there's this sort of sense of divide and rule, or this strategy of divide and rule that they pursued for a very long time. I think that we could probably say that having the military back in charge is not likely to be welcomed in many parts of the periphery. I think that even though many ethnic minority groups and organizations representing their interests have been skeptical about the NLD's ability to sort of negotiate a sustainable nationwide peace. Having the military back in charge, the force that has been active in these regions for decades, attacking ethnic minority communities, committing human rights abuses on a massive scale, will be seen in very negative light indeed. But in the longer term, I think the point I made in the article you referenced was that there really are two. The struggle between Aung San Suu Kyi and the generals, the NLD and the military, which has been ongoing since 1988, really, since the protests of that year, is connected to, but is in many ways separate to, the more complex struggle for ethnic autonomy in outlying regions of the nation. From these regions, from the perspective of these regions, the NLD and the military, while they do, differ on many important issues, they are both ethnic Burman-dominated institutions, and that both have been, to varying degrees, insensitive to the needs of ethnic minorities and the aspirations of ethnic minorities. And so, that I think that this, even if there was to be a solution to this conflict between the NLD and the military, a decisive, lasting solution one way or the other, even if there were to be a democratic solution, it wouldn't automatically solve this question of how the country handles its multi-ethnic reality and the sort of the influence of ethnic Burman chauvinism and nationalism and the the various myths that are attached to that.
Mm-hmm. So, what should we make of this 1-year state of emergency that's been declared? What will become of the NLD, of Aung San Suu Kyi? I mean, I know that these are, questions that might evade answers this early on, but what's your sense of where this is going?
I mean, my sense is that the government, the military, will probably, in the long run, seek to, re-engineer the system that they created in 2008. As I said, they're keeping the constitution in place. The question is whether now they feel changes are warranted to the constitution to give them a bit more of a guaranteed, a bit more guaranteed prominence in the political system.
Hmm.
So I think it's probably in their interests to, stage a return to multi-party democracy at some stage, but we don't know, what restrictions will be placed on the NLD. There's a host of uncertainties at the moment.
Right.
I would say that, a long-term spell of military rule is probably unlikely, but, I also, like many people, thought that, didn't expect this to happen, as it has. And so, really, it's very hard to say. I think that as the next few months go by, we'll probably start to get a better sense of exactly what they intend and are likely to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always I think that's one of the advantages of the podcast format with things like this. We can just kick around some speculative ideas on something that remains
Sure,
very
yeah.
uncertain. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the international reaction. So the Biden administration has officially declared it a coup d'état, which has consequences in U.S. law for foreign aid and so forth. There's also an interesting sort of, I guess, for someone like Jake Sullivan, who worked this issue under Hillary Clinton. I mean, Myanmar was one of the big successes of Obama's first term in Asia. So now
Right,
it's
or Kirk
interesting.
Campbell, yeah.
Yeah, Kirk Campbell. I mean, all these folks, they come back, and this is one of the first major crises in Asia that they're dealing with. I mean, on that note, when I was listening to you talk about, allegations of electoral fraud, I was wondering why the Myanmar military didn't take advantage of the final months of the Trump administration to do something like this when there would have been a little bit less attention. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but that'd be interesting. Anyways, so international reaction, U.S. has called it a coup. I think people got a good laugh out of the Xinhua headline saying that Myanmar had quote reshuffled its cabinet in describing the coup. ASEAN, meanwhile, never an organization to spend too much time talking about the internal affairs of its constituent states, is also part of this picture. So walk us through. I mean, what the major reactions have been so far, and what we should expect. I mean, in the next few months, just in terms of the international reaction to this coup.
Well, for many Western democracies, it's obviously been, instant condemnation, and rightly so. I think what we're likely to see in the coming months is increasing pressure on the generals to roll back some of the moves that they've taken to, even to sort of reverse the coup and reinstate some form of democratic rule, to release political prisoners, etc. And that's sort of unsurprising. I think, given how much energy was invested in this idea of Myanmar's democratic transition, there's a sort of, there's obviously a lot of outrage about the turn that it's taken. And we could talk about whether, Western governments were too rosy in their assumptions about Myanmar's realities back at the time, and sort of were the bar was set so low that the military was able to, regain Western support and get the sanctions removed, through a transition to a system which still retained, preserved most of their prerogatives. ASEAN, its statement was, by ASEAN standards, fairly strongly worded, but there's always a limit to how far ASEAN is willing to go on questions of human rights, criticizing the human rights records of its member states, and, as you say, interfering in their internal affairs. And so there's not really any surprise there. There could be a role for ASEAN to play in all of this. I mean, ASEAN has, been flexible on, these questions of non-interference and, national sovereignty in the past when it comes to Myanmar. I mean, it stripped Myanmar of its rotating chairmanship of ASEAN in 2006, I believe. So, it could be part of a wider solution. But the problem that I think a lot of the Western countries are going to face is that, Myanmar, is likely to have at least the passive support of China. And that's going to make it very difficult to rally any sort of international consensus around what's happened in Myanmar and any sort of joint international reaction to it. It was notable that the UN Security Council resolution or a statement that was released yesterday, did enjoy China's support, but it was relatively, the support of China and Russia meant that the statement was, relatively muted, certainly much more muted than the statements that have come out of the U.S. State Department and other Western governments. But I think that, we can talk about what China's reaction to this coup has been, but I think in general terms they will hoist high the banner of non-interference and present themselves once again in a pattern that we've seen play out many times in Myanmar as a
Right.
sort of understanding neighbor and partner who doesn't judge and whose partnership is consistent and solid. And I think that this will place Western countries, especially the United States, in a difficult position.
Yeah.
I think they're going to face a contradiction between the
Right.
goal of sort of promoting a democratic outcome in Myanmar and getting the generals to wind back the coup, and also the wider strategic question of China's influence in Myanmar and not wanting to go down a road that sees Myanmar become ever more dependent on China. So I mean, this pattern we see play out in many other parts of Southeast Asia over the past couple of decades, and I think that this challenge starkly illustrates one of the main dilemmas that the Biden administration faces in Southeast Asia,
Hmm.
which is that there's no longer, if there ever was an international liberal consensus. There's an
Right.
increasing number of countries, both big and small, that are pushing back against liberal norms, and sort of advancing a very sovereigntist vision of international relations in which countries are divided by hard borders and transnational principles, international principles like human rights stop, are subordinate to that principle.
Right.
So, I think this is very tricky for Western governments, and it's going to be hard for them to thread the needle of sort of condemning the coup and taking effective actions against it, while also, trying to secure what they perceive to be their national interests in the region.
Yeah, I mean, the toolkit here I think is fairly predictable, right? I mean, sanctions mostly, and strongly worded statements. It's interesting. I
Right.
mean, I'm glad we're getting to the China angle of this a little bit later in the discussion because a lot of the coverage you read, at least here in the United States, has really talked about this coup through. I mean, everything in the United States is now seen through the lens of great power competition. So it was a little frustrating to see some news coverage that sort of put this into a neat sort of good for China, bad for America kind of
Mm.
dichotomy. And I mean, things as we know with the Diplomat, I mean, things are always more complicated in Asia. I mean, this has been a story that's played out. Obviously, a coup is a different sort of circumstance here, but we've seen this over and over with changes in governments. For instance, in democracies around Asia in the past, where there is a change in government and immediately there's a geopolitical narrative that comes out of that. But I mean, as you hinted, I mean, this I think is complicated, right? I mean, the Tatmadaw itself has its suspicions about China and the United States alike. So I think that ultimately means that this won't necessarily shake out into that sort of clear narrative, right? I mean, you have the concerns
Mm.
around China potentially working with non-state groups in the borderlands in some cases. Meanwhile, you do have this sort of test. I don't really like that term, but this challenge, I guess, for the Biden administration, which is now going to have to take a big call early on about the extent to which values versus sort of realpolitik considerations weigh on this particular issue.
Mm.
But I mean, you already shared a few thoughts on how China is going to play this, but I mean, if you're the top Mada and you're trying to I mean, obviously, when you carry out a coup like this, you bake in costs, international costs, into what you assume will happen afterwards. And I'm sure they've done that. They've anticipated sanctions, strongly worded
Mm.
statements, and those have come now. But what would you do if you're the top Madad to sort of maximize your chances of having a better relationship with China in the near term? Because that really seems to be the best bet if at least for the next year, this is how things are going to be run in Myanmar.
I think they can depend on China for diplomatic support. I mean, they've enjoyed it on many occasions in the past. They can probably, if they want to purchase arms, I'm sure, they've done that in the past. China is an important economic partner, an important source of investment. So I think that they could fairly safely assume that China would be there as it has been in the past. I think that the relationship between Myanmar and China and the Myanmar military in China particularly has always been sort of fraught with tension. I mean, on the one hand, you have two groups that have a lot of shared interests in the sense of sort of opposing this liberal international consensus, and resisting attempts by Western governments to sort of force change in Myanmar. China's opposed to that on sort of political and ideological grounds, and the Myanmar military obviously wants to resist pressure to give up power, or otherwise curb its own interests. But there's also, I think proximity breeds friction. The two nations share 2,000 kilometers shared border, which runs through areas that have been, very, loosely, have always existed in a very loose relation to the central Myanmar state. Large parts of these borderlands that are that are under the control of ethnic armed groups with close ties to China have only really rarely have never, in some cases, been under effective central state control. And I think that this is a huge source of insecurity for the military, and that the question of China's relationship with these groups, as well as the sort of shadow of its past support for the Burmese Communist Party and the insurgency that it waged in the 60s and 70s, is very much conditions the military's view of China. But China is also a very useful partner, as Aung San Suu Kyi discovered on coming to power. And so, I think that what we've seen in Myanmar in recent decades has sort of been this constant push and pull. The two nations have been pushed together by shared strategic and ideological interests, but there's always been an undercurrent of suspicion on the part of the Myanmar government and indeed the Myanmar people about China's true intentions in the country. And I think that this is likely to continue, even if China enjoys a quote unquote advantage in the short term. The pendulum is always likely to slide back in the other direction. We saw that after a decade ago, when the military dominated government of the time initiated an opening to the West. One of the motivations for that was to diversify the nation's foreign relations and attract foreign investment, and to sort of shrug off the pariah status that had clung to the nation for so long. And so there was sort of this, and that there was a lot of tension that developed in the relationship with China due to the heavy reliance that Myanmar had been forced into. And so there's no clear win for China here. It's going to be, there'll be opportunities that arise that Beijing will be very flexible in seizing, but the same constraints will remain in place, I think.
Right. And, before we close out the conversation today, I do want to also give some attention to Myanmar's western frontier, right? Both India and Bangladesh have, I think, had an increasingly complex and deepening relationship in the case of India and Myanmar. And with Bangladesh, of course, the primary concern still remains the relationship at the Rakhine border and the fate of the Rohingya. Could you just briefly comment on, what we might expect from those two, I guess, bilaterals, the India-Myanmar and Bangladesh-Myanmar relations?
This is not something I'm a specialist in. I would predict that India will probably take a more pragmatic position toward the military government than it has in the past. Yeah. India was actually, in 1988 was surprisingly forthright about the need for the government of the time to respect the democratic values, and after 1990 to respect the result of the election that was held that year. But I think with the rise of China, we're probably likely to see a more, and an increasing Indian concerns about China, we're likely to see a more sort of realpolitik approach to, to what's happened there. That also may reflect the Modi government's, illiberal turn also, that it's not so concerned, it's not advocating liberal principles in the way that it might have 2 or 3 decades ago. But I think in terms of the Rakhine situation, one of the really interesting questions that remains is whether the fragile ceasefire that exists in the west of the country between the Myanmar military and the Arakan army is likely to hold. And this was a development that followed the election, when one of the rare sort of good news stories to come out of Myanmar was that the Japanese peace envoy helped to broker this ceasefire between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military, and with the aim of holding elections that had been called off during the November 8 poll. And in this particular instance, the one party that was resisting this push for elections to be held was the NLD government. And I think that maybe in some ways this issue, was an outgrowth of NLD, mounting NLD military tensions. But now that the military is in charge and the NLD no longer has a say, is there a possibility of the ceasefire holding some more lasting solution to that conflict, or will it be, will the Arakan army be concerned by this lurch back into military rule, and will it create further suspicion and endanger the ceasefire? We don't really know, but that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the only other thing that occurs to me on at least the Bangladesh-Myanmar relations is the extent to which the coup is going to completely throw a wrench in the plans for repatriating Rohingya refugees, which is never a particularly straightforward process to begin with, but I think now appears a lot less certain than it even was before. But yeah.
That's really remains to be seen at this stage.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, this is, I think, going to be something that we'll return to on the agenda this year for sure. So, Sebastian, I first of all want to thank you for taking the time to come back on the podcast and talk to me. I was actually reflecting on our conversation at the end of 2020 when we talked about, what lies ahead in Southeast Asia in the context of at least the United States. And, I remember you reflecting on the broader turn in the region away from democracy and universal liberal values, so to speak, and lo and behold, we begin 2021 with a coup in Myanmar. So, maybe you did see it coming in your subconscious, even if you, were still a little surprised. But no, thanks a lot for taking the time. It was really a pleasure. I learned a lot from this conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Ankit.
For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you leave us a review. You can do that on your chosen podcast provider, be that Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, anything out there. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, but you haven't yet subscribed, make sure you do that so you don't miss future episodes. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.